I was organizing our home office when my husband casually mentioned he'd been working late again. For 3 years, I believed those late nights were about his career. But when our 14-year-old son brought me a crumpled hotel receipt he'd found in his father's jacket pocket, everything I thought I knew about my marriage crumbled. What my son did next didn't just expose the truth. It changed the course of our entire family's future. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Rebecca Chen, and I used to believe that love could survive anything if you just worked hard enough at it. I'm a high school English teacher in Portland, Oregon, where the rain falls like clockwork and coffee shops outnumber churches 3-1. Our neighborhood sits in the hills overlooking the city, filled with craftsman houses and families who wave from their front porches. To everyone who knew us, Marcus and I were the couple who had it all figured out. 15 years of marriage, a beautiful teenage son named Dylan, successful careers, and what appeared to be an unshakable foundation. Marcus works in commercial real estate development, the kind of job that requires charm, persistence, and an ability to make people believe in visions they can't yet see. He's always been good at selling dreams. Tall, confident, with graying temples that make him look distinguished rather than old, he has this way of commanding attention when he walks into a room. When we first met at a mutual friend's housewarming party, I was drawn to his ambition, his plans for the future, the way he talked about building something meaningful together. And then there's Dylan, our son, who inherited his father's height and my tendency to notice details others miss. At 14, he's already showing signs of the man he'll become, thoughtful, protective, with a quiet intensity that sometimes catches adults off guard. He's the kind of teenager who still hugs his mom goodbye before school, who remembers to ask how my day went, who notices when I'm tired even when I think I'm hiding it well. Dylan has always been our bridge, the best parts of both Marcus and me combined into someone who sees the world with fresh eyes and an old soul's wisdom. For years, our life felt like a well-orchestrated dance. Marcus would leave early for site visits and client meetings. I'd drop Dylan at school before heading to my classroom, and we'd reconvene for dinner around 7, sharing stories from our respective days. Weekends meant hiking trails in the Columbia, River Gorge, trying new restaurants in the Pearl District, or simply lounging at home while Dylan worked on his photography projects and Marcus reviewed contracts. We weren't perfect, but we were solid. Or so I believed. The cracks started small, almost imperceptible. Marcus began staying later at the office, citing new projects that required evening presentations. He'd come home around 9 or 10, apologizing for missing dinner, explaining that the commercial development market was more competitive than ever. His phone started buzzing with texts during our family time, messages he'd glance at quickly before setting the device face down on the table. When I asked about work stress, he'd give me just enough detail to satisfy my curiosity without really saying anything substantial. I found myself making excuses for his absence. When Dylan asked why Dad missed his basketball games, I'd explain that this was a crucial time in Marcus's career, that the sacrifices we made now would benefit our family's future. When friends commented on his absence from social gatherings, I'd laugh and say he was married to his work. I became skilled at filling the gaps he left behind, attending school events solo, handling household decisions that used to be shared, responsibilities, maintaining connections with couple friends even when it felt awkward to show up alone. The loneliness crept in gradually, like fog rolling off the Pacific. I'd lie in bed listening to Marcus shower after his long days, wondering when we'd stop talking about anything deeper than schedules and logistics. Our conversations became transactional. Who would pick up Dylan from practice, whether we needed groceries, what time the dentist appointment was scheduled. The intimate moments that used to punctuate our days, spontaneous kisses in the kitchen, late-night conversations about dreams and fears. the comfortable silence of two people who truly knew each other, all of that slowly evaporated. I threw myself into my teaching with renewed energy, staying after school to help struggling students, volunteering for curriculum committees, organizing fundraisers for the drama department. If Marcus could find fulfillment in his expanding career, I reasoned, I could do the same. My students became my emotional outlet, their enthusiasm for literature and writing filling some of the void that was growing at home. I discovered I had a gift for helping teenagers navigate their own relationship struggles, ironically enough, becoming the teacher they sought out for advice about love, friendship, and family conflicts. Dylan, meanwhile, was developing his own interests and independence. His photography hobby evolved into genuine talent, and he spent hours capturing the moody beauty of Portland's urban landscapes. He'd show me his work with pride, explaining the technical aspects of lighting and composition with an expertise that amazed me. During those moments, examining his photographs together, I felt most like myself, engaged, curious, present. He had a way of seeing beauty in ordinary moments that reminded me there was still wonder in the world, even when my marriage felt increasingly hollow. The financial picture of our family also began shifting in ways that didn't quite add up. Marcus mentioned new business expenses, client dinners at upscale restaurants, weekend conferences in Seattle and San Francisco, professional development courses that required overnight stays. Our credit card statements showed charges I didn't recognize, but when I asked about them, Marcus always had reasonable explanations. A dinner with potential investors here, a hotel stay for a delayed flight there, networking events that were essential for building relationships in his industry. I wanted to trust him. More than that, I needed to trust him. The alternative, that the man I'd built my life with was lying to me, felt too devastating to seriously consider. So I rationalized the late nights, the mysterious expenses, the growing emotional distance. I told myself this was temporary, a phase that ambitious couples navigate together. I convinced myself that Marcus's dedication to his career was actually dedication to our family's future security. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. My friends at school started noticing changes in me that I couldn't see myself. Sarah, the librarian who'd become my closest confidant, mentioned that I seemed tired more often, that my usual optimism had dimmed. When I brushed off her concerns, she persisted gently, asking if everything was okay at home. I gave her the same explanations I'd been giving everyone else. Marcus was busy with work. We were both focused on our careers. This was just a demanding season of life. But privately, I was struggling. Sleep became elusive as I lay awake, analyzing conversations for hidden meanings, wondering if I was being paranoid or simply perceptive. I found myself checking Marcus's behavior against articles about relationship warning signs, then immediately feeling guilty for doubting him. The cognitive dissonance was exhausting. Part of me sensed something was wrong, while another part desperately wanted to preserve the life we'd built together. Dylan began asking more pointed questions about his father's schedule. Why did Dad miss so many family dinners? Why didn't he come to school events anymore? Why did he seem distracted even when he was home? I found myself defending Marcus to our son, explaining that adult responsibilities sometimes required sacrifices, that his father's hard work was motivated by love for our family. But even as I spoke these words, they felt increasingly hollow. The house began to feel different, too. Rooms that had once buzzed with family activity now felt cavernous and quiet. I'd cook dinner for 3, knowing only Dylan and I would be eating together. I'd plan weekend activities hoping Marcus might join us, only to receive last-minute texts about urgent work obligations. The photographs on our mantelpiece, family vacations, anniversary celebrations, Dylan's milestones, started to feel like museum pieces from someone else's life. I began noticing Marcus's habits more critically. How he showered immediately after coming home, as if washing away traces of his day. How he kept his phone with him constantly, even taking it to the bathroom. How he'd developed new preferences, different cologne, updated wardrobe, suddenly caring about fitness in a way he never had before. When I complimented these changes, he'd smile and mention something vague about wanting to look professional for clients. The gaslighting was subtle but consistent. When I expressed feeling disconnected from him, he'd suggest I was being overly sensitive or that I was projecting my work stress onto our relationship. When I mentioned missing our time together, he'd remind me of all the financial pressures he was managing, making me feel selfish for wanting emotional connection when he was sacrificing for our family's stability. I began questioning my own perceptions, wondering if I was creating problems where none existed. Meanwhile, Dylan was becoming increasingly protective of me in ways that both touched and worried me. He'd offer to help with household tasks that used to be Marcus's responsibility. He'd suggest mother-son outings when his father was unavailable, for family plans. He'd listen intently when I talked about my day, offering thoughtful responses that showed genuine interest in my life. At 14, my son was providing emotional support that my husband had stopped offering. The breaking point was building slowly, imperceptibly, like pressure accumulating behind a dam. I could feel something shifting in the foundation of our family, but I couldn't identify the source of the instability. Marcus continued his pattern of late nights and weekend obligations. I continued teaching my students about love and betrayal in classic literature while living in denial about my own story. And Dylan continued watching, absorbing, processing the undercurrents of tension that Marcus and I thought we were hiding. What I didn't know was that Dylan had already begun noticing discrepancies in his father's stories, dates that didn't match up with school events Marcus claimed to attend, business trips that seemed to require more luggage than overnight stays typically warranted, phone calls that ended abruptly when family members entered the room. My son was developing his own suspicions, conducting his own quiet investigation, preparing to uncover truths that would shatter our family's carefully constructed facade. The hotel receipt he would eventually find wasn't the first piece of evidence Dylan had collected. It was simply the one that would force all of us to stop pretending that everything was fine. 3 months before Dylan discovered that receipt, I had started experiencing what I can only describe as an intuitive awakening. You know how sometimes your body knows something before your mind catches up? I'd wake up with an inexplicable heaviness in my chest, a feeling that something fundamental was shifting beneath the surface of our carefully orchestrated life. My students began commenting that I seemed more distracted during lessons, that my usual passion for analyzing character motivations in literature had taken on an almost desperate quality. I found myself assigning more works about betrayal and deception, Othello, The Great Gatsby, Anna Karenina, and watching my students' faces as we discussed the warning signs that fictional characters missed. During one particularly intense class discussion about Gatsby's delusions, a bright senior named Maya raised her hand and said, "Mrs. Chen, why do smart people ignore obvious red flags?" The question hit me like a physical blow. I stood there, staring at 17-year-old faces waiting for wisdom I wasn't sure I possessed about my own life. That night, I did something I hadn't done in months. I waited up for Marcus to come home from another late meeting. When his key turned in the lock at nearly midnight, I was sitting in the living room with a cup of tea, no book, no grading papers, just waiting. He seemed startled to find me there, almost guilty, though he quickly covered it with exhaustion. "Becca, you didn't have to wait up," he said, loosening his tie with movements that seemed rehearsed. "The Hawthorne project ran way later than expected. You know how these developers can be." I studied his face in the lamplight, searching for the man I'd fallen in love with 15 years ago. Marcus, when was the last time we talked? Really talked? He paused, one hand still on his tie, and for a moment I saw something flicker across his features. Panic? Sadness? Relief? but it was gone so quickly I couldn't be sure it had been there at all. "We talk all the time," he said, moving toward Sai. "The stairs. We're talking right now." "No, we're not," I said quietly. "We're performing a conversation. There's a difference." He stopped at the bottom of the staircase and turned back to me. In that moment, I felt a spark of hope that maybe this could be our turning point, our chance to address whatever was creating this distance between us. But instead of sitting down, instead of asking what I meant, he simply said, "I'm really tired, Becca. Can we do this tomorrow?" Tomorrow never came. At least not the conversation I was hoping for. Instead, what came was a series of small revelations that painted a picture I was desperately trying not to see. Dylan started spending more time in Marcus's home office, ostensibly doing homework, but actually developing what I now realize was his own investigation. My son had inherited my attention to detail and his father's persistence, a combination that made him formidable when he set his mind to something. One evening in February, as rain drummed against our windows and I was grading essays about truth and illusion in Shakespeare, Dylan appeared in the kitchen doorway with an expression I'd never seen before. He looked older somehow, as if he'd aged months in the space of an afternoon. "Mom," he said carefully, "can I ask you something?" I set down my red pen and gave him my full attention. "Always. Do you think Dad seems different lately?" The question hung in the air between us like a bridge I wasn't sure I was ready to cross. This was my 14-year-old son asking me to acknowledge something I'd been avoiding for months. I could deflect, protect him from adult concerns, maintain the illusion that everything was fine, or I could honor his intelligence and intuition by engaging honestly. "Different how?" I asked. Dylan moved to the kitchen island and sat across from me, his teenager's frame still growing into itself. "He's just not really here anymore. Even when he's home, it's like he's thinking about somewhere else. And his stories don't always match up." "What do you mean, match up?" "Like last week, he said he had a client dinner downtown, but I saw him putting golf clubs in his car. And remember when he said he was in Seattle for that conference? I checked the weather for a school project, and it was sunny there, but his umbrella was still wet when he came home." My heart began racing, but I kept my voice steady. "Sometimes business trips change plans, honey. Maybe he had meetings closer to home than he expected." Dylan nodded, but I could see in his eyes that my explanations weren't satisfying his growing suspicions. "I just worry about you sometimes, Mom. You seem sad lately." That night after Dylan went to bed, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror and really looked at myself for the first time in months. The woman staring back at me had worry lines I didn't remember, a tightness around her eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights and unanswered questions. When had I become someone who made excuses for feeling lonely in her own marriage? When had I started accepting crumbs of attention and calling it love? I began paying closer attention to details I'd previously overlooked. Marcus's travel schedule seemed increasingly erratic, with last-minute changes that required him to pack quickly and leave with minimal explanation. His grooming habits had shifted subtly: new cologne that was more expensive than his usual choice, designer shirts that seemed unnecessary for construction site visits, a gym membership he'd never mentioned but that showed up on our bank statements. The financial inconsistencies became harder to ignore as well. Charges for restaurants in neighborhoods where Marcus claimed to have no business meetings. Hotel expenses that seemed excessive for the one-night stays he described. When I asked about these discrepancies, he always had explanations that were detailed enough to seem plausible but vague enough to avoid verification. Meanwhile, my relationship with Dylan was deepening in ways that both comforted and concerned me. He began taking on responsibilities that weren't traditionally his, helping with yard work, offering to cook dinner when I was tired, even attempting to fix a leaky faucet that Marcus had promised to address for weeks. It was as if my son was trying to fill the gaps his father was leaving behind. We started having what I came to think of as our evening talks. After Marcus retreated to his office to handle urgent emails, Dylan and I would sit in the living room discussing everything, from his photography projects to current events to his thoughts about the future. These conversations revealed a young man with remarkable emotional intelligence and a protective instinct that both impressed and worried me. "Mom," he said during one of these talks, "do you ever think about what you want your life to look like? In 5 years?" The question caught me off guard. "What do you mean? Like, I know you love teaching, but do you have other dreams? Things you want to do that aren't about taking care of other people?" I stared at my son, amazed by his insight. When had he become so perceptive about my own unfulfilled aspirations? "Why do you ask?" "Because sometimes I think you forget that you're allowed to want things for yourself. Dad's always chasing his next big project, and I'm figuring out what. I want to study in college, but you're always just making sure everyone else gets what they need." That night, I lay awake thinking about Dylan's question. What did I want my life to look like? For so long, my dreams had been intertwined with Marcus's ambitions and Dylan's needs that I'd lost sight of my own desires. I'd always wanted to write, perhaps publish the poetry I'd been scribbling in notebooks for years. I'd dreamed of traveling to places that inspired great literature. I'd imagined having deep friendships with other women who understood the complexity of balancing career, marriage, and motherhood. When had I stopped believing those dreams were possible? The answer came to me with startling clarity. I'd stopped dreaming when I'd started making excuses for someone else's behavior. Every time I rationalized Marcus's absence, justified his emotional distance, or accepted his vague explanations, I was choosing his comfort over my own clarity. I was teaching myself that my intuition couldn't be trusted, that my needs weren't as important as maintaining peace. Spring brought changes that made the cracks in our foundation impossible to ignore. Marcus's business trips became more frequent, his explanations more elaborate, his mood increasingly defensive when questioned about details. He started working out regularly, claiming it helped with stress management, but the physical changes seemed designed for someone else's appreciation rather than general health. I found myself becoming a detective in my own home, noticing things I'd previously dismissed. Receipts that didn't match his stories. Phone calls that ended abruptly when I entered the room. A new habit of doing his own laundry, claiming it was more efficient than waiting for me to get around to it. Each small discovery felt like a piece of a puzzle I didn't want to complete. Dylan's behavior was changing too, but in the opposite direction. While his father became more secretive, my son became more transparent, more communicative, more present. He started asking detailed questions about my day, showing genuine interest in my students' progress, even helping me brainstorm creative lesson plans. It was as if he was consciously choosing to fill the emotional space his father was abandoning. One particularly meaningful moment came when Dylan presented me with a photography project he'd been working on secretly for weeks. He'd captured images of our daily life, me grading papers at the kitchen table, tending the garden, reading on the porch, and arranged them in a series he called The Heart of Home. The accompanying artist's statement read, "This series explores how one person's consistent presence can create stability and beauty even when other elements are unstable." Looking at those photographs, seeing myself through my son's eyes, I realized something profound. While I'd been focusing on what Marcus wasn't giving me, I'd been overlooking what I was actively contributing to our family's foundation. I wasn't just a supporting character in someone else's story. I was the author of resilience, the creator of sanctuary, the architect of love in our home. That realization began shifting something fundamental in how I approached my days. Instead of waiting for Marcus to acknowledge my efforts, I started acknowledging them myself. Instead of seeking validation from someone who seemed incapable of providing it, I began finding strength in my own competence and compassion. I started writing again, filling journals with observations about human nature, family dynamics, and the quiet heroism of daily life. My poetry began reflecting themes of awakening, of recognizing one's own worth, of finding beauty in resilience rather than romance. The words flowed with an urgency I hadn't felt since college, as if my creative voice had been waiting for permission to tell the truth about my experience. My teaching also evolved during this period. I began incorporating discussions about self-worth and personal integrity into our literature studies. When we read about Elizabeth Bennet refusing Mr. Darcy's first proposal, I asked my students to consider what it means to value yourself enough to reject what doesn't serve you, even when it seems like the practical choice. When we analyzed Nora's decision to leave her family in A Doll's House, we explored the courage required to choose authentic living over comfortable pretense. These classroom discussions became a form of therapy for me, a way to process my own situation while helping young people develop critical thinking about relationships and self-respect. My students responded with unusual engagement, sharing their own insights about recognizing when love becomes conditional, when support becomes control, when loyalty becomes enabling. Sarah, my librarian friend, noticed the changes in me before I fully recognized them myself. "You seem different lately," she observed during one of our lunch conversations. "Stronger somehow. More. Present." Present? Like you're actually inhabiting your own life instead of just managing everyone else's. Her words crystallized something I'd been feeling but couldn't articulate. For months, maybe years, I'd been living as a supporting character in my own story, reacting to other people's choices rather than making conscious decisions about what I wanted and deserved. The slow awakening I was experiencing wasn't just about recognizing problems in my marriage. It was about remembering who I was beyond my roles as wife and mother. But even as I was growing stronger and more self-aware, the situation with Marcus was reaching a crisis point. His absences became more frequent, his explanations more strained, his defensiveness more pronounced. The emotional distance between us had grown so vast that we barely seemed like residents of the same house, let alone partners in the same marriage. Dylan was watching all of this with the careful attention of someone who understood more than he was saying. I could see him processing the dynamics, drawing conclusions, preparing for something I couldn't yet imagine. My son was developing a plan, though I wouldn't understand its scope until much later. The hotel receipt he would find wasn't an accident. It was the culmination of weeks of careful observation, strategic positioning, and a 14-year-old's determination to protect the parent who had consistently protected him. Dylan had been building toward a moment of revelation that would change everything, though none of us realized how close we were to that precipice. What I know now is that children see truth more clearly than adults who have invested years in maintaining comfortable illusions. Dylan wasn't just finding evidence of his father's betrayal. He was preparing to give me the gift of clarity, the proof I needed to stop making excuses and start making choices that honored my own worth. The storm was building, and my son was about to become the lightning that illuminated everything we'd been too afraid to see clearly. The morning Dylan found the hotel receipt started like any other Thursday in May. I was preparing for a faculty meeting about graduation requirements while simultaneously packing lunch for my son and mentally reviewing the day's lesson plan on tragic heroes in classical literature. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd be teaching about characters whose fatal flaws led to their downfall while living in complete denial about the tragedy unfolding in my own home. Marcus had left early for what he called a breakfast meeting with the development team, kissing my cheek in that perfunctory way that had become our standard goodbye. His touch felt like an obligation rather than affection, but I'd grown so accustomed to emotional crumbs that I barely registered the hollowness anymore. Dylan was getting ready for school, moving through his morning routine with the methodical precision he'd inherited from me. "Mom," Dylan called from upstairs, "Dad left his lucky jacket. Should I bring it to him?" Marcus had a navy blazer he claimed brought him good fortune during important presentations. It was expensive, well-tailored, and he wore it whenever he wanted to make a particular impression. The fact that he'd forgotten it seemed unusual, given that today was supposedly a crucial client meeting. "Just hang it back in his closet, honey," I called back. "He can pick it up later if he needs it." What I didn't know was that Dylan had been waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity. My son had developed what I can only describe as a systematic approach to understanding the inconsistencies in his father's behavior. He'd been noting discrepancies between Marcus's stated plans and observable evidence, creating what amounted to a teenage investigation that would put professional detectives to shame. As Dylan later told me, he'd been checking Marcus's jacket pockets not out of curiosity, but out of a growing sense of responsibility to protect our family from whatever truth was lurking beneath the surface of our carefully maintained normalcy. He'd found business cards from restaurants Marcus claimed never to have visited, parking stubs from locations that didn't match his alleged whereabouts, and now, crumpled in the inside pocket like discarded evidence, a receipt that would shatter every illusion we'd been collectively maintaining. The Riverside Inn, room 247, 2 nights. The dates corresponded exactly with Marcus's claimed business trip to Eugene, a trip that was supposed to involve camping out in conference rooms and budget hotels while negotiating a complex commercial development deal. But the Riverside Inn wasn't in Eugene. It was a boutique hotel in downtown Portland, less than 30 minutes from our house, known for its romantic ambiance and discretion. Dylan stared at that receipt for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. My son, who had been protecting me emotionally for months without my full awareness, suddenly found himself holding physical proof that his father was living a double life. The weight of that knowledge, the responsibility of deciding what to do with it, must have been overwhelming for a 14-year-old who just wanted his family to be whole and honest. But Dylan didn't panic. He didn't rush downstairs to share his discovery immediately. Instead, he did something that revealed the depth of his maturity and his understanding of human nature. He photographed the receipt with his phone, carefully documenting the details, then returned it to exactly where he'd found it. He was creating evidence while preserving the original context, ensuring that when the truth finally emerged, it couldn't be dismissed or explained away. When Dylan came downstairs for breakfast, he looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. There was sadness there, yes, but also determination and something that looked almost like relief. He'd been carrying suspicions for months, and now he had confirmation. The uncertainty was over, even if the real challenge was just beginning. "Mom," he said carefully, spreading peanut butter on his toast with unusual deliberation, "can I ask you something about trust?" I looked up from my lesson plans, struck by the seriousness in his voice. "Of course. If someone you love is lying to you and you have proof, what's the right thing to do?" The question hit me like a physical blow, though I tried not to show it. "That's a complicated situation, Dylan. It would depend on the circumstances, the relationship, the nature of the lie. But what if the lie is really big, like something that affects the whole family?" I set down my coffee and gave him my full attention. There was something in his tone, an urgency masked as casual curiosity, that made my maternal instincts flare. "Is there something specific you want to talk about?" Dylan met my eyes for a long moment, and I could see him weighing his options, calculating the best approach. Finally, he said, "I just think people deserve to know the truth, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard." After Dylan left for school and I headed to my own classroom, his words echoed in my mind. There had been something prophetic about his question, as if he was preparing me for a revelation I wasn't ready to receive. As I taught my students about Oedipus's desperate attempts to avoid his fate while simultaneously running toward it, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was living my own form of tragic irony. That afternoon brought an unexpected twist that would later seem like cosmic preparation for the evening's revelations. During my last period, while discussing the concept of willful blindness in literature, One of my students, a particularly insightful junior named Alex, raised a question that stopped me cold. Mrs. Chen, why do people choose to ignore obvious signs that something's wrong? Like, even when everyone around them can see the truth? What do you mean? I asked, though part of me already knew where this conversation was heading. Like, in the stories we read. The characters always miss these huge red flags because they don't want to see them. But real people do that too, right? They convince themselves everything's fine when it's obviously not. The classroom fell silent as 15 pairs of 16-year-old eyes waited for my response. These students had been watching me for months. I realized, probably noticing changes in my demeanor that I thought I was hiding. Teenagers are remarkably perceptive about adult struggles, especially when those struggles involve the gap between public presentation and private reality. Sometimes, I said slowly, people avoid painful truths because facing them requires courage they're not sure they possess. It's easier to hope things will improve on their own than to confront difficult realities that might demand significant changes. But doesn't that just make everything worse in the long run? Alex pressed. Usually, yes. Truth has a way of surfacing regardless of our attempts to suppress it. And when it does emerge, the damage is often worse than it would have been if addressed earlier. As I spoke these words to my students, I felt them reverberating in my own chest. I was teaching lessons about courage and truth-telling while actively avoiding both in my own life. The disconnect was becoming impossible to ignore. When I arrived home that afternoon, I found Dylan in the kitchen working on homework. With an intensity that seemed forced, he looked up when I entered, and I caught something flickering across his face, anticipation mixed with apprehension. "How was school?" I asked, beginning my usual routine of unpacking groceries and starting dinner preparations. "Good," he said, then paused. "Mom, what are you making for dinner?" "I thought I'd try that new salmon recipe. Why?" "Dad said he'd be home around 6 tonight, for sure this time." Something in Dylan's tone made me look at him more carefully. "Did he call you?" "Yeah, during lunch. He seemed, I don't know, different. Like he wanted to make sure we'd both be here." A chill ran down my spine, though I couldn't articulate. Why? Marcus rarely called Dylan during school hours, and he almost never confirmed dinner plans with such apparent urgency. Did he say what the meeting was about? Dylan's eyes met mine with an intensity that seemed far beyond his years. He just said it was important that we talk as a family tonight. As the afternoon progressed, Dylan's behavior became increasingly strange. He kept checking his phone, glancing toward the front door, and watching me with an expression that seemed almost protective. When I asked if he was okay, he assured me he was fine, but his body language suggested someone preparing for a significant event. At 5:30, Dylan disappeared upstairs, claiming he needed to finish a photography project. 20 minutes later, Marcus's key turned in the front lock. He appeared in the kitchen doorway with an expression I'd never seen before. Guilty, defensive, and strangely defeated all at once. "Becca," he said, his voice carrying a weight that immediately put me on high alert. "We need to talk." Those 4 words landed in the kitchen like an explosion. In 15 years of marriage, Marcus had never approached a conversation with such obvious reluctance and gravity. My heart began racing as dozens of possibilities flooded my mind, though the truth was still too devastating to contemplate directly. "About what?" I asked, though part of me already knew this conversation would change everything. Before Marcus could answer, Dylan appeared at the kitchen entrance. He looked pale but resolute, like someone who had made a difficult decision and was prepared to follow through regardless of the consequences. "Dad," Dylan said quietly, "before you say anything, I think you should know that I found this." My son pulled out his phone and showed Marcus a photograph. Even from across the room, I could see Marcus's face drain of color as he stared at the screen. Whatever Dylan was showing him hit like a physical blow, causing Marcus to actually stagger backward against the doorframe. "Dylan," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible. "Where did you—" "In your jacket pocket," Dylan said calmly. "The one you forgot this morning." I moved closer, and Dylan turned his phone toward me. The image showed a hotel receipt, the details crystal clear despite the photograph's amateur quality. Riverside Inn, room 247, 2 nights. The dates from last week when Marcus had supposedly been in Eugene closing a development deal. The world tilted sideways as the implications crashed over me. This wasn't just evidence of a lie. It was proof of a systematic deception that had been going on for who knows how long. The late nights, the mysterious expenses, the emotional distance, the defensive behavior. Suddenly every puzzling piece clicked into place with devastating clarity. "Marcus," I said, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. "What is this?" But before he could answer, Dylan stepped forward with the confidence of someone who had prepared extensively for this moment. My 14-year-old son looked directly at his father and said, "Mom deserves better than lies, and I'm tired of watching her blame herself for your choices." The kitchen fell into absolute silence. Marcus stared at Dylan with an expression of shock, as if seeing his son clearly for the first time. I stood frozen between them, holding onto the kitchen counter for support as my carefully constructed world crumbled around me. "Dylan," Marcus finally managed, "you don't understand." "I understand enough," Dylan interrupted, his voice steady despite his youth. "I understand that you've been lying to Mom for months. I understand that she's been making excuses for you while you've been betraying her trust. And I understand that someone in this family needs to choose her side, because you obviously haven't." The power in my son's words, the clear-eyed assessment of our family's dynamics, the courage it took for a teenager to confront his father's betrayal, all of it hit me like a revelation. Dylan hadn't just found evidence of Marcus's affair. He'd made a conscious choice to expose the truth because he couldn't bear to watch me continue living in denial. Marcus attempted damage control, launching into explanations that sounded rehearsed and desperate. He talked about stress, about making mistakes, about how it didn't mean anything, about how much he loved our family. But his words felt hollow, against the solid evidence Dylan had presented, and the months of gaslighting that had preceded this moment. I found myself looking at my son with a mixture of pride and heartbreak. Pride because he'd shown more integrity and courage than the adult man who was supposed to be modeling those qualities. Heartbreak because no child should have to be the one to rescue a parent from their own willful blindness. "How long have you known?" I asked Dylan quietly. "I started suspecting in February," he said. "The stories didn't add up, but I kept hoping I was wrong." "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Dylan's eyes filled with tears for the first time since this conversation began. "Because I wanted you to be happy, and I thought maybe if I was wrong, bringing it up would just hurt you for no reason. But then I realized that not telling you was hurting you anyway." Standing in that kitchen, looking at my son's tear-filled eyes and my husband's guilty face, I felt something fundamental shift inside me. The part of me that had been making excuses, rationalizing inconsistencies, and accepting emotional scraps finally stopped operating. In its place rose a clarity so sharp it was almost painful. Dylan had given me the truth, but more than that, he'd given me permission to stop pretending. He'd shown me that choosing reality over comfortable illusion wasn't just possible, it was necessary. And he'd demonstrated that sometimes the people we think we're protecting are actually the ones who end up protecting us. The conversation that followed would last hours, involving tears, accusations, admissions, and the slow dismantling of a marriage that had been dying for months. But in that initial moment of revelation, surrounded by the wreckage of my illusions, I felt something unexpected: relief. The truth, however painful, was finally in the open. And my son, my brave, wise, protective son, had been the one to ensure I couldn't hide from it anymore. The hours that followed Dylan's revelation felt like living inside a kaleidoscope. Everything I thought I knew about my life was shifting, breaking apart, and reforming into patterns I'd never imagined possible. Marcus spent the evening alternating between desperate explanations, angry defensiveness, and finally, exhausted confession. Her name was Jennifer. She worked in marketing for one of his development companies. The affair had been going on for 8 months. But what struck me most profoundly wasn't the details of Marcus's betrayal. It was watching Dylan throughout that endless night. My son sat in our living room like a young guardian, monitoring the conversation with an emotional intelligence. That astounded me. When Marcus tried to minimize his actions, Dylan would quietly interject with questions that cut through the manipulation. When I began to waver, considering whether this could somehow be salvaged, Dylan gently reminded me of my own worth. "Mom," he said during one particularly difficult moment when Marcus was pleading for another chance, "remember what you tell your students about tragic heroes? How their downfall comes from making the same mistakes over and over?" Even in the midst of my heartbreak, I felt a surge of pride so powerful it almost knocked me over. My child, this incredible human being I'd helped raise, was using the very lessons I'd taught him to help me navigate the most challenging moment of my adult life. He was demonstrating a level of emotional maturity that many adults never achieve. Around midnight, when Marcus finally exhausted his repertoire of excuses and promises, an unexpected calm descended over me. I looked at my husband, really looked at him, and realized I was seeing clearly for the first time in years. The man sitting across from me wasn't the person I'd fallen in love with, but he also wasn't a monster. He was simply someone who had made choices that prioritized his own immediate gratification over the well-being of his family. Understanding this difference was crucial to how I would move forward. "Marcus," I said quietly, "I need you to leave tonight." He started to protest, to negotiate, to promise immediate changes that we all knew were impossible to implement. But Dylan stood up from his chair and moved to stand beside me, not in a threatening way, but in a gesture of solidarity that spoke volumes. "Dad," Dylan said with a maturity that broke my heart, "the best thing you can do for all of us right now is respect what Mom is asking." That night, after Marcus packed a bag and left for his brother's house, Dylan and I sat together in the living room surrounded by the debris of our former life. I expected to feel devastated, lost, uncertain about the future. Instead, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: authentic peace. "Are you okay?" Dylan asked, studying my face with concern. "You know what's strange?" I replied. "I think I am. For the first time in a long time, everything feels real." Dylan smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him in months. "That's because we don't have to pretend anymore." The next few weeks brought challenges I'd never anticipated, but they also revealed strengths I didn't know I possessed. The practical aspects of separation were daunting: finances, legal consultations, explaining the situation to friends and family. But underneath the logistical complexity, something beautiful was emerging. The person I'd been before I'd started shrinking myself to accommodate someone else's limitations. I threw myself into my teaching with renewed passion, bringing authentic emotion to discussions about literature that resonated with my students in powerful ways. When we analyzed poems about resilience and renewal, I spoke from lived experience rather than academic theory. My classroom became a space where young people could explore themes of courage, self-worth, and the difference between love and dependency. One particularly meaningful moment came when my student Maya, the one who'd asked about people ignoring red flags, approached me after class with tears in her eyes. "Mrs. Chen," she said, "I don't know what's happening in your life, but whatever. It is. Thank you for showing us that it's possible to choose yourself. My mom has been in a bad relationship for years, and after our discussions about character agency, I finally found the courage to talk to her about it. These moments reminded me that our personal transformations ripple outward in ways we can't always predict or measure. By choosing authenticity over comfort, I was modeling possibilities for the young people in my care, and they were responding by finding their own courage to demand better for themselves and their loved ones. Dylan flourished in ways that surprised everyone, including his school counselors. Rather than being traumatized by his parents' separation, he seemed liberated by the honesty it brought to our family dynamic. His grades improved, his photography became more adventurous and expressive, and he began talking about future plans with enthusiasm I hadn't seen since he was much younger. "It's like our house can breathe again," he told me one evening as we prepared dinner together, a ritual that had become one of our favorite parts of each day. "What do you mean?" "Before, it always felt like we were all holding our breath, waiting for something bad to happen. Now that the bad thing has happened and we've dealt with it, we can just be ourselves." His insight was profound. We had been living in a state of chronic tension, trying to maintain a facade that required constant energy to sustain. Now that the pretense was gone, we could redirect that energy toward authentic living and genuine growth. I started writing again, not just in journals, but with intention toward publication. The poems that emerged from this period were raw, honest, and ultimately hopeful. Explorations of what it means to reclaim your own narrative after years of living in someone else's version of your story. Several pieces were accepted by literary magazines, small victories that felt monumental after years of creative silence. My relationship with Dylan deepened in beautiful ways. Without the need to protect him from adult dysfunction, I could parent from a place of strength rather than damage control. We had honest conversations about relationships, integrity, and the importance of choosing partners who enhance rather than diminish your essential self. "Mom," Dylan said one day while showing me his latest photography series, powerful images of urban renewal and natural resilience, "I want you to know that what you did, choosing truth over comfort, that's the kind of person I want to be." "You already are that person," I told him. "You're the one who made it possible for me to see clearly." Marcus tried multiple times to reconcile, showing up with flowers, writing letters, even attending therapy sessions alone in an attempt to demonstrate his commitment to change. But something fundamental had shifted in me. I could see his efforts were motivated more by his own discomfort with consequences than by genuine understanding of the harm he'd caused. During one of our few conversations about potential reconciliation, I asked him a question that clarified everything for both of us. "Marcus, if Dylan hadn't found that receipt, how long would you have continued the affair?" His inability to answer definitively told me everything I needed to know. He was sorry he'd been caught, sorry our family was disrupted, sorry his comfortable double life had imploded. But he wasn't genuinely sorry for the choices that had brought us to this point, because those choices had been working perfectly well for him until they were exposed. The divorce proceedings, while emotionally challenging, became an exercise in reclaiming my voice and advocating for my own interests. I discovered I was much stronger and more capable than I'd believed during my marriage. With the help of an excellent attorney and the support of friends I'd reconnected with during this process, I navigated the legal complexities with confidence that surprised everyone, including myself. 6 months after that night in the kitchen, Dylan and I were living in a smaller house closer to downtown Portland. The space was ours, decorated according to our tastes, organized around our routines, filled with books and art and music that reflected our actual preferences rather than compromise positions. Our evening talks continued on the front porch of our new home, watching the city lights twinkle below us as we planned adventures and discussed dreams that suddenly seemed achievable. I was offered the opportunity to teach a graduate-level course on literature and personal transformation at Portland State University, a position that would have been impossible to accept during my marriage, due to the evening schedule conflicts with Marcus's networking obligations. Now it represented exactly the kind of professional growth I'd been hungering for without fully acknowledging. Dylan's photography was gaining recognition beyond our local community. His series documenting urban families, single mothers, blended families, multi-generational households, had been selected for exhibition at a downtown gallery. His artist's statement read, "These images explore how families create strength and beauty through honesty rather than perfection." One evening, as we prepared for the gallery opening that would showcase Dylan's work, I looked at my son adjusting his tie in the hallway mirror and felt overwhelmed by gratitude for the person he'd become and the role he'd played in our family's transformation. "Dylan," I said, "I need you to know something. What you did that night, showing me the receipt, making it impossible for me to keep pretending, that was one of the most loving things anyone has ever done for me." He turned from the mirror with that wise expression I'd come to recognize, the look of someone who understands that love sometimes requires difficult actions. "Mom, watching you shrink yourself to fit Dad's version of marriage was like watching someone suffocate in slow motion. I couldn't let that continue, especially when I knew you were capable of so much more." At the gallery opening, surrounded by friends, colleagues, and fellow artists who were celebrating Dylan's talent and vision, I had a moment of profound clarity about the journey we'd traveled together. The path from that devastating night in our kitchen to this celebration of creativity and authenticity hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary. During his speech at the exhibition, Dylan looked directly at me and said, "This series is dedicated to my mom, who taught me that the most courageous thing you can do is choose truth over comfort, even when that choice temporarily breaks your heart." The applause that followed felt like a standing ovation for every difficult decision we'd made, every moment of uncertainty we'd navigated, every time we'd chosen growth over stagnation. I realized that what had felt like the end of my life was actually the beginning of living authentically for the first time in years. Marcus attended the gallery opening, arriving alone and staying only briefly. Watching him view Dylan's photographs, images that told the story of our family's renewal without his participation, I felt something I hadn't expected: compassion without attachment. He looked lost, disconnected from the vibrant life Dylan and I were building together. I hoped he would find his own path to growth and authenticity, but I was no longer responsible for guiding that journey. After the guests left and we were helping clean up the gallery space, Dylan approached me with a photograph I hadn't seen before, a portrait he'd taken of me during one of our evening talks on the front porch. In the image, I was laughing at something he'd said, my face lit with genuine joy and confidence. "This is how I see you now," he said simply. "This is who you've always been, underneath all the pretending." Looking at that photograph, I saw a woman I recognized but hadn't encountered in years. Someone comfortable in her own skin, confident in her own worth, radiating the kind of peace that comes from living in alignment with your values rather than in opposition to them. That night, as Dylan and I drove home through the rain-washed streets of Portland, I reflected on the unexpected gifts that had emerged from our family's crisis. We'd discovered that children can be wise teachers, that truth-telling is an act of love, that courage is often quiet and methodical rather than dramatic and sudden. Most importantly, we'd learned that families aren't destroyed by honesty, they're strengthened by it. The version of our family that included Marcus had been built on avoidance, accommodation, and mutual pretense. The version that emerged after his deception was exposed was smaller but infinitely more solid, rooted in respect, communication, and authentic care for each other's well-being. "Mom," Dylan said as we pulled into our driveway, "do you ever regret how everything happened?" I considered his question carefully, thinking about the pain we'd endured, the uncertainty we'd navigated, the comfortable illusions we'd been forced to abandon. "I regret that it took so long for the truth to surface," I said finally. "I regret the months we spent living in denial, but I don't regret where we ended up. This version of our life feels real in a way that nothing has for years." Dylan nodded. And in that simple gesture, I saw acknowledgement of our shared journey from deception to authenticity, from fear-based choices to courage-driven decisions, from a family held together by pretense to a family strengthened by truth. As we walked up the path to our front door, I realized that the greatest gift my son had given me wasn't just the hotel receipt that exposed his father's betrayal. It was the reminder that I deserved better than settling for someone else's version of love, and that I was capable of creating a life that honored my own worth. The house we entered that night was filled with our own choices, our own dreams, our own authentic expressions of who we were when we stopped trying to be who someone else needed us to be. It was smaller than our previous home, but larger in every way that mattered. A space where truth was welcome, growth was celebrated, and love was defined by respect rather than control. That night, for the first time in years, I fell asleep not wondering what tomorrow would reveal about my marriage, but excited about what Dylan and I might create together in our continued journey toward authentic living. 1 year after that, transformative night in our kitchen, I stood in front of my graduate students at Portland State University, preparing to teach the final session of Literature and Personal Transformation. The course had evolved far beyond my initial academic vision into something that felt more like a masterclass in living authentically. Students from diverse backgrounds, divorced professionals returning to education, young adults questioning inherited beliefs, survivors of various forms of betrayal, had gathered each week to explore how literature could illuminate pathways to personal courage. Dylan, now 15 and serving as my unofficial teaching assistant for photography assignments, sat in the back corner documenting our final presentations. His camera captured not just images but moments of revelation as students connected literary themes to their own experiences of growth and renewal. Watching him work, I marveled at how our shared crisis had transformed both of us into educators in ways we'd never anticipated. Today, we're discussing the concept of post-traumatic growth, I began, looking out at faces that had become familiar and dear over the semester. This is the idea that some individuals don't just recover from difficult experiences, they actually become stronger, wiser, and more fulfilled than they were before the crisis occurred. A student named Maria, a single mother who'd left an abusive marriage 2 years prior, raised her hand. "Professor Chen, how do you know the difference between genuine growth and just telling yourself you're better off to avoid dealing with the pain?" The question struck me as particularly insightful, the kind of inquiry that could only come from someone who'd lived through significant loss and was still processing the aftermath. I looked toward Dylan, who nodded encouragingly, our silent signal that he was ready to share the story we'd been building toward all semester. "That's an excellent question, Maria, and it brings me to something personal I want to share with all of you." I took a deep breath, feeling the familiar flutter of nerves that always preceded vulnerability. Last year, my teenage son discovered evidence that my husband of 15 years was having an affair. The way my son handled that discovery, and the choices our family made in its aftermath, taught me everything I now understand about the difference between surviving crisis and using crisis as a catalyst for authentic transformation. The classroom fell silent with the particular quality of attention that emerges when academic theory meets lived experience. I could see students leaning forward, recognizing something in my tone that promised genuine insight rather than comfortable platitudes. The night my son showed me the hotel receipt that proved his father's betrayal, I had a choice. I could minimize the evidence, make excuses for the behavior, and return to a marriage built on willful blindness. Or I could acknowledge that my son had given me the greatest gift possible, the truth I needed to stop accepting less than I deserved. Dylan began photographing the students' faces as I spoke, capturing the range of emotions that accompany recognition of shared experience. Some nodded in recognition, others fought back tears. Several took notes with the urgency of people transcribing life-changing revelations. But here's what I learned about post-traumatic growth, I continued. It's not automatic. Crisis alone doesn't create wisdom. The growth comes from how you choose to metabolize the experience. Do you let it make you bitter and closed off, or do you let it teach you about your own resilience and capacity for authentic living? Over the following hour, students shared their own stories of crisis and transformation. Maria talked about discovering her strength as a single parent. James, a veteran dealing with PTSD, described how literature had helped him process experiences he couldn't discuss directly. Sarah, a recent college graduate questioning her family's religious expectations, explained how our readings had given her language for her own journey toward authentic identity. Dylan's photographs from that day would later become part of a larger series he called Classroom Courage. Intimate portraits of people in the act of truth-telling, their faces illuminated by the particular light that accompanies genuine vulnerability. The series would earn him a scholarship to art school and recognition as one of Portland's most promising young photographers. After class, as students filed out with hugs and promises to stay in touch, Maria lingered behind. "Professor Chen," she said quietly, "I have to ask, how did you know your son was mature enough to handle what he discovered? Weren't you worried about the psychological impact?" I considered her question carefully, remembering my own fears during those early weeks after Marcus left. You know what I learned? Children are incredibly resilient when they're living in truth, even difficult truth. What damages them is being asked to participate in maintaining lies that deny their own perceptions and experiences. Dylan looked up from packing his camera equipment and added, "The hardest part wasn't finding out about the affair. The hardest part was watching Mom blame herself for Dad's emotional distance and knowing something was wrong but not having proof. Once the truth was out, everything got clearer, even though it was also sadder." Maria nodded thoughtfully. "My kids have been asking questions about why their father and I separated. I've been trying to protect them from the details, but maybe I'm actually protecting them from understanding that their observations about our relationship were accurate. There's a difference between age-appropriate honesty and inappropriate disclosure," I replied. "But children deserve to know that their perceptions matter, that their emotional safety is a priority, and that the adults in their lives are committed to truth-telling rather than secret-keeping." That evening, Dylan and I drove to our favorite coffee shop in the Alberta Arts District, a ritual we'd developed for processing significant days. As we settled into our usual corner booth with laptops and sketch pads, I reflected on how much our relationship had evolved since becoming a family of two. "Mom," Dylan said, reviewing the photographs he'd taken in class, "I've been thinking about applying to that summer documentary program at the Northwest Film Center, the one that focuses on social justice storytelling." "That sounds incredible. What would you want to document?" "Families like ours. People who've chosen truth over comfort. I think there are stories about courage and resilience that don't get told because they're not dramatic enough for mainstream media, but they're actually the most important stories." As Dylan described his vision for the documentary project, I felt that familiar surge of pride mixed with awe at the person he was becoming. Our crisis had revealed not just his protective instincts and emotional intelligence, but also his calling as an artist committed to illuminating difficult truths, with compassion and dignity. "You know what strikes me about your idea?" I said. "You're not interested in exposing dysfunction for shock value. You want to document the process of transformation that can emerge from honest reckoning with reality." "Exactly. Like, Dad's affair was terrible, but what happened after? How we chose to rebuild our family around truth instead of pretense. That's the story that might actually help other people." 2 weeks later, I received an unexpected phone call that would open another chapter in our ongoing transformation. Dr. Elizabeth Harrison, the director of a family therapy center in Seattle, had heard about my graduate course through professional networks and wanted to discuss a potential collaboration. We're developing a program for families dealing with infidelity and other trust violations, Dr. Harrison explained during our initial conversation. Traditional couples therapy often focuses on repairing the existing relationship, but we're interested in helping people discern whether repair is actually possible or advisable. Your approach to literature as a framework for understanding personal agency could be valuable for our clients. The opportunity to contribute to therapeutic programming felt like a natural extension of the work I'd been doing in the classroom. After several more conversations with Dr. Harrison's team, I agreed to develop a workshop series called Narrative Reclamation, using story to rebuild identity after betrayal. Dylan was immediately enthusiastic about the project, volunteering to create a photographic component that would document participants' journeys without compromising their privacy. His artistic vision had matured to the point where he could capture emotional truth through imagery that was both powerful and respectful. Our first workshop took place on a rainy Saturday in November, exactly 18 months after Marcus's betrayal was exposed. 12 individuals, mostly women, but also 2 men and 1 non-binary participant, gathered in a circle to explore how literary archetypes could illuminate their own experiences of trust violation and recovery. Today, we're going to look at the hero's journey, I began, but with a specific focus on what happens when the call to adventure comes not from external circumstances, but from internal recognition that your current life is unsustainable. The participants ranged in age from mid-20s to early 60s, representing various forms of betrayal: extramarital affairs, financial deception, emotional manipulation, substance abuse secrets. What united them was the experience of discovering that someone they'd trusted had been living a double life. I want each of you to think about the moment you first suspected something was wrong, I continued. Not the moment you received proof, but the moment your intuition began signaling that something in your relationship wasn't aligned with the story you'd been telling yourself. The sharing that followed was profound and heartbreaking. Participants described months or even years of explaining away inconsistencies, making excuses for changed behavior, and doubting their own perceptions. The relief of finally acknowledging their intuitive wisdom was palpable in the room. Dylan moved quietly around the circle, photographing hands, facial expressions, and body language that conveyed the complexity of emotions accompanying truth-telling. His images from that day would later be displayed alongside participant poetry in an exhibition called Unraveling and Reweaving: Art from the Journey of Reclamation. One participant, a woman named Janet, whose husband had hidden a gambling addiction for 3 years, shared an insight that crystallized something important for everyone present. I kept thinking I was going crazy because nothing added up. But I wasn't going crazy. I was staying sane in an insane situation. My confusion was actually evidence that my internal compass was working perfectly. During our lunch break, I noticed Dylan deep in conversation with Michael, one of the male participants whose wife had been embezzling money from their joint business. They were discussing the specific challenges of being a man in a support group focused on betrayal and how traditional masculine expectations can complicate the process of seeking help and expressing vulnerability. "Your son is remarkably insightful," Michael told me later. He asked questions about my experience that my therapist hasn't thought to explore. He has a gift for seeing beyond surface presentations to underlying emotional reality. That afternoon, we worked with literary examples of characters who had to choose between comfortable lies and difficult truths. We discussed Anna Karenina's awakening to the limitations of her marriage, Jane Eyre's refusal to accept Mr. Rochester's proposal to become his mistress, and Celia's gradual recognition of her own worth in The Color Purple. What these characters teach us, I explained, is that transformation requires active choice. It's not enough to simply recognize that your situation is problematic. You have to decide that you deserve better and then take concrete steps toward creating a life that aligns with your values. The workshop series continued monthly for 6 months, with participants returning to share their progress and challenges. Dylan documented the evolution he observed in their faces, their posture, their way of occupying space in the room. His final photograph showed the entire group laughing together during our closing celebration, their bodies relaxed and open in ways that hadn't been possible during our first session. During our final workshop, Janet shared an update that moved everyone to tears. 6 months ago, I felt like my entire identity had been destroyed along with my marriage. But working through these stories helped me realize that my identity was never actually dependent on my husband's choices. I am who I've always been, someone with good judgment, strong values, and the capacity for deep love. His betrayal doesn't change any of that. As the workshop series concluded, Dr. Harrison approached me about expanding the program to serve other therapy centers throughout the Pacific Northwest. The demand for trauma-informed approaches to relationship betrayal was significant, and our model of combining literary analysis with creative expression was producing remarkable results. What you and Dylan have created together, Dr. Harrison observed, is something unique in the field. You're not just helping people process trauma, you're helping them recognize their own heroism in surviving and transcending difficult circumstances. That spring, Dylan's documentary about families choosing truth over comfort was selected for screening at the Portland International Film Festival. The 20-minute piece included interviews with several of our workshop participants, footage of my university classes, and intimate moments from our own family's journey toward authentic living. The film's premiere was held at a downtown theater, with friends, colleagues, and family members filling the seats. Marcus attended, sitting alone near the back. During the post-screening discussion, he approached the microphone during the audience Q&A session. "I'm the father and ex-husband featured in this film," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "I want to say publicly that what my son and former wife accomplished after my betrayal required courage I didn't possess. They chose growth where I chose avoidance, truth where I chose deception, and forgiveness where I deserved resentment." The audience was silent as Marcus continued. "I've spent the last 2 years in therapy, working to understand how I convinced myself that betraying my family was acceptable. What I've learned is that people like my son and ex-wife, people who choose honesty even when it's costly, they're the ones who make the world more trustworthy for everyone else." After the screening, Dylan and Marcus had their first extended conversation since the night the affair was revealed. They walked to a nearby park while I waited in the theater lobby, giving them space to navigate their relationship without my mediation. When they returned an hour later, both looked emotionally drained but somehow lighter. Dylan explained later that they'd discussed the possibility of rebuilding their father-son relationship on a foundation of honesty rather than pretense. "I told him I'm willing to have a relationship with who he actually is," Dylan said, "but not with the performance of who he thinks I want him to be. We'll see if he can handle that level of authenticity." 6 months later, Marcus began attending our monthly workshops as a participant rather than a topic of discussion. His presence was initially uncomfortable for me, but I came to appreciate his willingness to examine his own behavior publicly and support others who were grappling with the aftermath of betrayal. During one particularly powerful session, Marcus shared his perspective on the night Dylan revealed the hotel receipt. "For months, I'd been living in terror that my double life would be exposed. When my son confronted me with evidence, my first emotion wasn't guilt or sadness, it was relief. The exhaustion of maintaining lies was finally over." As our second year of workshops concluded, I reflected on the unexpected ways that crisis had become a catalyst for service. What had begun as personal survival had evolved into a calling to help others navigate their own journeys from betrayal to empowerment. Dylan, now 17 and preparing for college, had been accepted to several prestigious art programs with scholarships based on his documentary work and photography. His artist's statement for applications read, My work explores how ordinary people demonstrate extraordinary courage by choosing truth over comfort, growth over stagnation, and authentic living over comfortable pretense. On the evening before Dylan left for his freshman year at the Rhode Island School of Design, we sat on our front porch having one final evening talk before this chapter of our shared journey concluded. "Mom," Dylan said, "I want you to know that everything we went through, Dad's affair, the divorce, rebuilding our family, I wouldn't change any of it." "Really? Even the painful parts?" "Especially the painful parts. They taught me that I can handle difficult truths, that honesty is more important than harmony, and that the people worth loving are the ones who choose your well-being over their own comfort." As I watched my son pack his camera equipment and photography portfolios the next morning, I realized that our family's crisis had produced something extraordinary: a young man with unshakable integrity, emotional intelligence beyond his years, and a commitment to using his talents in service of truth-telling and justice. The house felt different after Dylan left for college. Quieter, but not empty, peaceful rather than lonely. I had learned to distinguish between solitude and isolation, between independence and abandonment. For the first time in my adult life, I was comfortable with my own company, confident in my own judgment, and excited about possibilities that belonged entirely to me. That fall, I was invited to speak at conferences about post-traumatic growth, narrative therapy, and the role of truth-telling in family healing. Dylan would often join me via video call from his dorm room, sharing his perspective on how children can become agents of positive change when adults create space for their wisdom. During one particularly memorable presentation at a conference in Denver, an audience member asked, "What advice would you give to someone who suspects their partner is being unfaithful but doesn't have proof?" I thought about Dylan's courage, about the months he spent collecting evidence not to destroy our family, but to save it from the slow death of denial. "Trust your intuition," I replied, "and remember that seeking truth isn't an act of betrayal, it's an act of love. Love for yourself, love for your children, and ultimately, love for everyone involved, because living in lies serves no one well." As I stood there answering questions from people hungry for hope in the aftermath of their own betrayals, I felt Dylan's presence across the miles, my teacher, my partner in transformation, my reminder that courage can emerge from the most unexpected sources when we create space for truth to flourish. Our story wasn't over. It was simply entering a new chapter, one where the lessons we'd learned through crisis could become gifts we offered to others, still finding their way from betrayal to empowerment, from broken trust to rebuilt wisdom, from the end of one story to the powerful beginning of another. 3 years after Dylan left for college, I received a call that would forever change how I understood the true scope of our family's transformation. The voice on the other end belonged to Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, a researcher at Stanford University who had been studying intergenerational patterns of resilience and truth-telling in families. "Professor Chen," she said, "I've been following your work with narrative therapy and post-betrayal recovery. But what really caught my attention was your son's documentary series, Invisible Courage. The way he captures the moment when someone chooses authenticity over comfort. It's unlike anything I've seen in my 15 years of research." Dylan, now in his junior year at RISD, had expanded his original documentary into a multi-part series that followed families navigating various forms of crisis with honesty rather than denial. His work had been featured in film festivals from Sundance to Cannes, not for its artistic innovation alone, but for its unprecedented insight into how courage manifests in ordinary domestic moments. "Dr. Rodriguez," I replied, "what specifically about Dylan's work interests you from a research perspective?" "We're documenting something that challenges everything we thought we knew about family resilience," she explained. "Traditional models suggest that children need protection from adult problems, but your son's story, and the stories he's now documenting, suggest that children can actually become catalysts for family healing when they're trusted with age-appropriate truth. This conversation led to an invitation that would reshape the next phase of my life. Stanford was launching the first-ever Institute for Family Truth and Healing, and they wanted Dylan and me to co-direct the research division. The opportunity would allow us to study and support families who were choosing transparency over dysfunction, courage over comfort, and growth over stagnation. When I called Dylan to discuss the Stanford offer, his response was immediate and enthusiastic. "Mom, this feels like what we've been building toward without realizing it. All those workshop participants, all the families I've documented, they're proving that honesty isn't just morally right, it's psychologically and socially transformative." 6 months later, I found myself standing in a state-of-the-art research facility in Palo Alto, surrounded by colleagues who shared our passion for understanding how truth-telling could become a force for healing rather than destruction. Dylan had deferred his senior year to co-develop research protocols that would capture the nuanced ways families navigate disclosure, forgiveness, and reconstruction. Our first major study focused on what we termed child-initiated family transformation situations, where young people become agents of positive change by refusing to participate in family systems built on denial or deception. The preliminary results were extraordinary. Families that allowed children to voice concerns about dysfunction showed dramatically higher rates of successful intervention and long-term stability. "What we're discovering," Dylan explained during our first major research presentation, "is that children often see family problems more clearly than adults because they haven't yet learned to rationalize dysfunction. When we honor their perceptions instead of dismissing them, they can guide entire families toward healthier dynamics." The audience of family therapists, social workers, and researchers was captivated by Dylan's insights. At 21, he was already being recognized as a thought leader in trauma-informed family intervention. But what impressed colleagues most was his ability to translate academic concepts into accessible wisdom. During the Q&A session, a therapist from Seattle raised her hand. "Dylan, how do you help adults overcome their instinct to protect children from family problems?" "You help them understand the difference between protection and denial," Dylan replied. "Protection means creating safety for children to express their observations and feelings. Denial means asking children to pretend they don't see or feel what they're actually experiencing. One builds trust, the other destroys it." As our research progressed, we began receiving requests from families around the world who wanted support in navigating crisis with integrity rather than avoidance. These weren't just families dealing with infidelity. They included parents struggling with addiction, families coping with mental illness, and multi-generational conflicts rooted in secrets and shame. One family that particularly impacted our work was the Nakamura family from Portland. 16-year-old Kenji had discovered that his father, a respected surgeon, had been struggling with prescription drug addiction for 2 years. Instead of hiding this discovery or confronting his father privately, Kenji approached his mother with a proposal. The family should enter treatment together, with honesty about the addiction as the foundation for healing. Dylan documented the Nakamura family's journey over 18 months, capturing not just the initial crisis, but the painstaking work of rebuilding trust through consistent truth-telling. The resulting film, The Courage to See, won the Audience Choice Award at the Tribeca Film Festival and sparked national conversations about how families can transform crisis into opportunity for deeper connection. "What Kenji taught us," I explained during a keynote address at the American Family Therapy Association conference, "is that children don't need perfect parents. They need honest ones. When adults demonstrate that truth-telling is more important than reputation management, children learn that they can trust their own perceptions and advocate for their own well-being." The impact of our work began extending beyond individual families to influence policy and practice in schools, healthcare systems, and social services. Dylan's photography exhibitions, now shown internationally, were being used in training programs for professionals who work with families in crisis. One particularly powerful image from his Invisible Courage series showed the hands of a 10-year-old girl reaching across a kitchen table to comfort her mother, who had just disclosed a history of domestic violence. The photograph captured something essential about how children can become sources of strength for adults when they're invited into age-appropriate truth rather than protective lies. Art has the power to change hearts in ways that research alone cannot, Dylan observed during an interview with Art in America magazine. When people see these images of ordinary families choosing courage over comfort, they recognize possibilities for their own lives that they hadn't previously considered. Meanwhile, my academic work was evolving beyond trauma recovery to explore what we termed preventive authenticity, helping families develop patterns of truth-telling that could prevent crises rather than simply respond to them. The curriculum I developed was being implemented in parenting education programs across the Pacific Northwest. One afternoon, while reviewing applications for our fellowship program, I came across a submission that stopped me cold. The applicant was Jennifer Martinez, the woman Marcus had been involved with during his affair. She was requesting support to help her own family heal from the generational patterns of deception that had influenced her choices. I realize this might seem inappropriate, her application letter read, but I've been following your work for 2 years, and I believe what you're teaching could have prevented the choices I made. I want to break the cycle of secret-keeping and self-deception in my own family before it damages my children the way it damaged me. Dylan and I spent hours discussing how to respond to Jennifer's application. Ultimately, we decided that excluding her would contradict our core principle that healing is possible for everyone willing to engage in honest self-examination. 6 months later, Jennifer became one of our most effective workshop facilitators, bringing unique insight into how individuals can recognize and interrupt their own patterns of self-destructive behavior. Her presence initially triggered complex emotions for me, but working together on family healing projects gradually transformed our relationship from painful association to mutual respect. What Jennifer's journey taught me, I shared during a workshop on forgiveness and accountability, is that the person who betrayed you can sometimes become your most powerful ally in understanding how dysfunction operates and how it can be transformed. As our 4th year at Stanford concluded, Dylan made an announcement that both surprised and delighted me. He was returning to finish his degree at RISD, but with a new focus on developing immersive art installations that could help families practice difficult conversations in safe, supportive environments. I want to create spaces where people can rehearse courage, he explained. Virtual reality environments where parents can practice telling children difficult truths, where couples can explore honest communication, where families can experiment with authenticity before implementing it in their daily lives. His senior thesis project was an interactive installation called The Practice of Truth, which allowed visitors to navigate simulated family scenarios while receiving real-time feedback about the emotional impact of their choices. The installation traveled to museums and family centers across the country, giving thousands of people the opportunity to build skills for authentic communication. During Dylan's graduation ceremony at RISD, I sat in the audience overwhelmed by pride and gratitude for the journey we'd traveled together. The young man receiving recognition for his innovative approach to social justice art was the same person who, 7 years earlier, had courageously confronted his father's betrayal to protect our family's integrity. In his commencement speech as the graduating class's chosen speaker, Dylan addressed his fellow artists with characteristic wisdom. The most radical thing we can do as creators is tell the truth about human experience, not just the beautiful parts, but the broken parts that can become beautiful through honest attention and courageous action. After graduation, Dylan was offered positions at major museums and art institutions, but he chose instead to return to Portland and establish the Northwest Center for Family Courage, a nonprofit organization that would combine artistic expression with therapeutic support to help families navigate crisis with integrity. I decided to leave Stanford and join Dylan in this new venture, recognizing that our work had evolved beyond academic research into something more akin to a social movement. Families across the country were hungry for models of authentic living, and we had developed tools and insights that could meet that need. Our first community workshop in Portland attracted over 200 participants, including several families who had been following our work online for years. Among them was Maria, my former student from the university course, who brought her teenage daughter and ex-husband to explore how divorced families could maintain honesty and respect across separate households. 5 years ago, you taught me that children deserve to know their perceptions matter, Maria told the group during an opening circle. Today, my daughter and I have the most honest, supportive relationship I've ever experienced with anyone. And her father and I, while no longer married, are raising her together based on truth rather than resentment. The workshop series expanded rapidly, with facilitators trained in our methods offering programs in cities from Seattle to San Diego. Dylan's art installations became permanent fixtures in family service centers, and my curriculum was adopted by social work programs at universities nationwide. One particularly meaningful development was the emergence of what we called courage families, networks of people who had met through our programs and continued supporting each other through ongoing challenges. These families weren't related by blood, but by their shared commitment to choosing growth over stagnation, truth over comfort, and authentic connection over convenient pretense. During our 5th year of operation, the Northwest Center for Family Courage received a visit from representatives of the United Nations Children's Fund, who were interested in adapting our model for international use. They had been studying family intervention programs worldwide and concluded that our approach offered unique advantages in cultures where traditional hierarchies made it difficult for children to voice concerns about adult behavior. What you've developed, explained Dr. Amara Okonkwo, UNICEF's Director of Family Resilience Programs, is a framework that honors children's wisdom while building adult capacity for authentic leadership. This combination could be transformative in communities where family dysfunction has become normalized across generations. The conversation led to pilot programs in refugee communities, where families were navigating not just individual trauma, but collective displacement and cultural transition. Dylan's artistic methods proved particularly effective in these contexts, offering nonverbal ways for children and adults to express complex emotions and experiences. One 9-year-old refugee from Somalia, working with Dylan during an art therapy session, created a drawing that perfectly captured the essence of our work: a small figure holding a large key, standing in front of a door marked Truth. When asked to explain the image, she said simply, "Sometimes the littlest person has to open the biggest door." That drawing became the logo for our international programs, symbolizing how children can unlock possibilities for healing that adults might not perceive or pursue independently. As I write this, 10 years after Dylan first found that hotel receipt in Marcus's jacket pocket, our center has worked with over 5,000 families, trained more than 300 facilitators, and inspired similar programs on 4 continents. Dylan's documentary work has been seen by millions, and my academic publications are being translated into dozens of languages. But the statistics that matter most to me are more personal. Marcus has been in recovery from his patterns of deception for 8 years and has become a valued contributor to our men's accountability groups. Dylan and his father have rebuilt their relationship on a foundation of honest communication and mutual respect. I have found love again, with someone who values my truth-telling as much as my tenderness, my strength as much as my vulnerabilities. Most importantly, our family's crisis became the catalyst for a movement that continues growing beyond anything we could have imagined. Every week, I receive letters from families who have used our tools to navigate their own challenges with courage rather than avoidance, honesty rather than denial. Last month, a mother from Ohio wrote, "My 8-year-old son came to me with concerns about his teacher's behavior toward students. Instead of dismissing his observations, I remembered your teachings about trusting children's perceptions. We reported the situation together, and an investigation revealed serious problems that affected multiple children. My son learned that his voice matters, and I learned that children can be our most important allies in creating safer communities. These stories remind me daily that individual acts of courage create ripple effects we may never fully comprehend. When Dylan chose to show me that hotel receipt, he wasn't just exposing his father's betrayal. He was initiating a chain of events that would touch thousands of lives and challenge fundamental assumptions about how families can heal and grow. Tonight, as I prepare for tomorrow's workshop with 30 new families seeking support in their journeys toward authentic living, I'm filled with gratitude for the unexpected ways that our deepest wounds can become our greatest sources of wisdom and service. Dylan, now 25 and recognized internationally for his contributions to family healing through art, continues to amaze me with his insights and compassion. During our weekly planning meetings, he often shares observations that redirect our work in more effective directions. "Mom," he said recently, "I think the most important thing we've learned is that courage isn't a personality trait. It's a skill that can be developed. Every family we work with proves that ordinary people can make extraordinary choices when they have the right support and tools." As families around the world continue reaching out for support in choosing truth over comfort, growth over stagnation, and authentic connection over convenient pretense, I'm reminded that our story is both uniquely ours and universally relevant. The details may differ, but the fundamental choice remains the same for every family. Will we have the courage to see clearly, speak honestly, and love authentically? The answer, as thousands of families have proven, is a resounding yes. When we remember that the smallest voices in our families often carry the greatest wisdom, and the most difficult truths often lead to the most beautiful transformations. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.